Hey, tonight we're diving into something that sounds like science fiction, but was terrifyingly real. Imagine being told you have exactly 90 seconds on a rooftop. Not 90 seconds to grab lunch, not 90 seconds to make a phone call. 90 seconds because that's all the time your body can handle before the radiation coursing through that space guarantees you'll be dead within weeks. You taste metal on your tongue. Your face tingles like someone's pressing 1,000 pins against your skin. The debris you're supposed to shovel glows with a darkness you've never seen before, and every cell in your body is screaming at you to run the other direction. But you don't. Because if you don't do this, millions of people across Europe might die instead. Nearly 4,000 men stood on that rooftop in the summer of 1986. They called them biorobots, which is perhaps the most chilling thing the Soviet Union ever came up with, a word that means human beings doing work that actual robots couldn't survive. They were part of a force of 600,000 people, maybe more, pulled from across the Soviet Union to clean up history's worst nuclear disaster. The reactor explosion at Chernobyl on April 26th released radiation equivalent to 400 Hiroshima bombs. Without the liquidators, that's what they called these cleanup workers, much of Europe would be uninhabitable today. But here's what nobody tells you about Chernobyl. It wasn't a story of heroes and villains. It was a story of ordinary people, many of them barely out of their 20s, thrown into an impossible situation with almost no information about what they were walking into. You're tuned to the Velvet Obscura. Tonight, we open another case. If you're finding these stories help you drift off, I'd really appreciate a quick like or subscribe. It helps more than you know. And I'm always curious where you're listening from tonight. Drop a comment with your location. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations. You've just been called up for duty in May of 1986. Maybe you're a coal miner in Donetsk. Maybe you're a soldier finishing up your military service. Maybe you're a chemist, an engineer, a construction worker. It doesn't matter. You're on a bus heading north, and nobody's told you much except that there's been an accident at a power plant and the motherland needs you. The other men on the bus are singing. There's this strange atmosphere, almost like you're heading to summer camp instead of whatever awaits you in a place called Chernobyl. Some of these guys are joking, talking about the medals they'll probably get, the stories they'll tell their grandchildren. You're 27 years old, maybe 28. You've got a wife back home, possibly kids. You're thinking this will take a couple weeks, maybe a month, and then you'll be back to your normal life. The singing stops as the bus gets closer. You see the checkpoint first, soldiers in protective gear waving you through. Then you notice something odd about the landscape. The trees look wrong, a strange rusty color you've never seen before. Later, you'll learn they call this the Red Forest, thousands of acres of pine trees that absorbed so much radiation in the first days after the explosion that they literally turned red and died. But right now, you just know something feels off. But you don't know that yet. The next morning, they feed you breakfast. And this is where things get strange. The meal isn't the usual Soviet fare, thin soup and black bread. It's a feast. Meat, as much as you can eat. Chocolate bars. Fresh fruit, which is almost unheard of. There's even Pepsi Cola, something most Soviet citizens might see once a year if they're lucky. It feels like a celebration. Some guys eat until they're sick. Others barely touch their plates, nerves getting the better of them. One of your roommates leans over and whispers, "They're fattening us up like cattle for slaughter." You laugh, but the joke doesn't feel funny. After breakfast, you line up for your medical check. A nurse takes your blood. A doctor listens to your heart. Then someone hands you a small card, your dosimeter record. This card will track how much radiation you absorb. The number at the top is 0. The number you're not supposed to exceed during your entire deployment is written on the back. You tuck it into your pocket and try not to think about it. The orientation is brief. You're told about the accident, though the details are vague. A reactor exploded. There was a fire. The situation is under control now, but cleanup work needs to be done. You'll be working in shifts, they say. Protective equipment will be provided, they say. Everything is perfectly safe as long as you follow procedures, they say. They don't tell you that the protective equipment is largely useless. They don't tell you that only 2 to 3% of workers even have dosimeters that actually work. They don't tell you that the radiation in some areas is so intense that spending 5 minutes there guarantees you'll develop acute radiation sickness. They definitely don't tell you that many of the procedures they're describing were made up yesterday. As you drift off that first night in the dormitory, listening to 30 other men breathing in the darkness, you wonder what tomorrow will bring. The taste of chocolate is still in your mouth. Your dosimeter card sits on the table next to your bunk, that 0 staring at you. Outside, somewhere in the darkness, 30 kilometers north, a destroyed reactor is pouring radiation into the night sky. You can't see it, can't smell it, can't feel it. That's what makes it so terrifying. The enemy is invisible. Morning comes early. You're assigned to a crew, loaded into a truck, and driven toward the plant. The closer you get, the stranger everything looks. There are vehicles everywhere, military trucks, construction equipment, helicopters overhead. But there are also abandoned cars on the side of the road, doors hanging open like their drivers just disappeared mid-journey. Buildings with windows blown out. Trees that look like they've been burned, except the fire was invisible. Your truck stops about 1 kilometer from the reactor. This is as close as vehicles are supposed to get. You'll learn later that many of the vehicles that went closer had to be abandoned because they became too radioactive to use. From here, you can see it. Reactor number 4, or what's left of it. The building is a shell, the roof completely gone, exposed steel beams reaching toward the sky like broken fingers. Even from this distance, you can see smoke rising from inside. Your crew leader, a man maybe 5 years older than you, who looks like he hasn't slept in days, explains today's task. See that pile of rubble? You're going to load it onto wheelbarrows and dump it into that pit over there. Simple enough. Except the rubble is contaminated. Except you're only supposed to work in 20-minute shifts before rotating out. Except the dosimeter you were issued yesterday probably isn't measuring most of the radiation you're actually absorbing. You put on your protective gear. It's not the lead-lined suit you might have imagined. It's a cloth jumpsuit, a paper mask, rubber boots, and gloves. As far as witnesses say, this gear offered about as much protection from gamma radiation as a raincoat offers protection from a hurricane. But you put it on anyway because it's all they have. And because not wearing it feels like giving up. The work is brutal. Not physically. Shoveling rubble isn't that demanding. But psychologically, every shovelful might be the one that pushes you over the edge, the one that delivers enough radiation to your bone marrow that your body will start shutting down in a few weeks. You can't see it happening. You can't feel it happening. The rubble looks like rubble. The dirt looks like dirt. But your hands are shaking as you work, and you're not sure if it's fear or if the radiation is already doing something to your nervous system. After 20 minutes, your shift is over. You drop the shovel and walk back to the truck, trying not to run, trying to maintain some dignity. Someone with a Geiger counter runs it over your body. It clicks frantically. "Too high," the man says. "You need decontamination." He points you toward a shower station, essentially a hose rigged up next to a tent. You strip down, hand your contaminated clothes to another worker who handles them with tongs, and stand under cold water while someone scrubs you with harsh soap. The water running off your body is tinted gray. This becomes your routine. Work, shower, eat, sleep, repeat. Days blur together. You stop counting after the first week. The other men in your dormitory become familiar. There's Vladimir, a miner from Donetsk, who jokes constantly to keep the fear at bay. There's Kamal, an Azerbaijani who barely speaks Russian but somehow communicates through gestures and expressions. There's Alexander, a chemistry specialist from Ukraine who actually understands what radiation is doing to your bodies and tries not to think about it. You notice changes in the dormitory population. Some faces disappear after a few days. You're told they reached their radiation limit and were sent home. You want to believe that, but you've also heard whispers about the hospital wing, about men developing strange symptoms, about bodies being shipped back to their families in sealed zinc coffins. One morning, they announce special volunteers are needed for a critical mission. The pay will be triple. The recognition will be significant. But they're very careful about the wording, very careful not to promise you'll survive it. You don't volunteer. You're not that brave, or maybe you're not that foolish. But Alexander does. He's a chemistry specialist, he says. He understands the mission. He knows what he's walking into. The mission is the roof. Reactor 3, next to the destroyed number 4, is still operating. They need to keep it running, need the power it generates. But its roof is covered in radioactive debris blown there by the explosion, chunks of graphite that had been inside the core of Reactor 4. This debris is so radioactive that robots can't function near it. The radiation destroys their electronic circuits in seconds. They tried Soviet robots. They tried a fancy West German robot called Joker. They even tried lunar rovers, machines designed for space. All of them failed, so they turned to biorobots. Alexander returns from his first shift on the roof looking like he's aged 10 years in 90 seconds. That's all they gave him. 90 seconds to run onto the roof, shovel as much debris as possible over the edge, and run back. He describes it like a nightmare. The Geiger counters screaming so loud they hurt your ears. The graphite chunks glowing with this weird black light. The metal taste flooding your mouth. The tingling in your face and hands that means your nerve endings are being destroyed. The absolute certainty that you're dying, that every second on that roof is stealing time from your life. They gave him a piece of lead to wear, he tells you that night. Just a thin sheet of lead, maybe 4 millimeters thick, strapped to his chest and back like armor. Based on what we know, it was essentially useless against the gamma radiation, but having something, anything, between you and the reactor core made psychological sense if nothing else. He's supposed to go back tomorrow. You watch him pack his things that night, moving slowly like every motion hurts. He's done, he says. One shift was enough. He's going to tell them he's sick, get himself sent home before they can argue. But the next morning, he's gone when you wake up. Whether he went back to the roof or managed to escape, you never find out. The beds in the dormitory get filled as quickly as they empty. As you drift off to sleep, you hear helicopters overhead, dozens of them, flying toward the reactor. They're dropping sand and lead onto the exposed core, trying to smother the fire. It's been weeks now, and the core is still burning. The helicopters fly low, some of them so close to the radiation plume that you hear later about pilots developing radiation sickness after just a few missions. Then, one day, you see one crash. It happens in slow motion. A helicopter approaches the reactor, and suddenly it starts spinning. The rotor blades hit something, maybe a crane cable, and the aircraft tumbles from the sky. It doesn't fall into the reactor like some people feared, but crashes onto the construction site next to it. The crew doesn't survive. Based on what witnesses say, it wasn't the radiation that killed them, it was the crash itself. But the distinction feels meaningless. Another set of bodies, another set of families getting the dreaded knock on the door. Your deployment enters its second month. Your dosimeter card shows numbers that should worry you, but you've stopped checking it. Everyone has. The numbers are lies anyway. The dosimeters only measure gamma radiation, not the beta particles that are probably doing just as much damage. And there's a rumor going around that command is pressuring the medical staff to underreport exposure levels, to fudge the numbers so they can keep workers on site longer. You believe the rumor. Then they announce a new mission. They need miners, not for mining exactly, but for tunneling. 400 miners are being brought in from Donetsk and the Moscow region to dig a tunnel under Reactor 4. The scientists are worried that the molten nuclear fuel, which they're calling corium, might burn through the concrete foundation of the reactor and reach the groundwater below. If that happens, if radioactive material gets into the water table, it could contaminate the entire Dnieper River system. Millions of people get their drinking water from that river. The Black Sea is fed by that river. The contamination could be catastrophic. So they need a tunnel that will allow them to install a cooling system under the reactor, a concrete platform that can keep the corium from melting through. It needs to be 136 meters long, dug through solid ground, underneath one of the most radioactive places on Earth. The miners arrive looking confident. These are professionals, men who've spent their lives underground in coal mines and subway tunnels. They're used to danger, used to working in conditions that would terrify most people. They're young, mostly, 25 to 30 years old, the kind of men who can handle 12-hour shifts in sweltering heat with minimal equipment. They'll need every bit of that toughness. The tunnel entrance starts under Reactor 3, boring horizontally toward the foundation of Reactor 4. The radiation isn't as intense down here as on the roof, but it's still significant. The bigger problem is the heat. The corium above them is still generating massive amounts of thermal energy. The tunnel is like an oven. Temperatures regularly exceed 40 degrees Celsius. The miners are supposed to work in their protective gear, but within hours they're abandoning it, working in minimal clothing just to avoid heat stroke. Some of them work completely naked. You don't see this firsthand. You're still doing your rotation of general cleanup work. But the stories filter back to your dormitory. The miners are working around the clock, 8 shifts of 3 hours each per day. They're digging with hand tools for the final section because powered equipment might damage the reactor foundation. They're soaked in sweat. The radiation monitors they carry flicker with alarming readings, but they keep digging because the alternative, letting the corium reach the groundwater is unthinkable. It takes 60 days to complete the tunnel, 60 days of brutal work in conditions that border on medieval. When it's finished, when the concrete cooling platform is finally installed, the miners emerge looking like ghosts of themselves. Many of them have lost significant weight. Their skin has a grayish cast. They're coughing constantly. Based on what later medical reports suggest, nearly all of them would be classified as invalids within 20 years. Half of them would be dead. But here's the devastating truth that comes out later, much later. The corium never reached the reactor foundation. It solidified before burning through the concrete. The tunnel, the heroic effort, the sacrifice of those 400 miners. It was all based on a worst-case scenario that never actually happened. The mission was deemed necessary because the risk was too great to ignore, but in the end, it wasn't needed. Imagine learning that. Imagine being one of those miners, living with radiation-induced illness for the rest of your life, and discovering your sacrifice was made to prevent something that never would have occurred. As you drift off to sleep that night, you think about the miners, about Alexander on the roof, about Vladimir and Kamal and the rotating cast of faces in your dormitory, about the firefighters who responded the first night, kicking around pieces of reactor core like they were ordinary rubble, about the helicopter pilots flying through radioactive smoke, about the 3 men who volunteered to dive into flooded reactor rooms to drain water that threatened another explosion. Everyone here is making impossible choices based on incomplete information. Speaking of those 3 divers, their story becomes legendary almost immediately. Alexei Ananenko, Valery Bespalov, and Boris Baranov volunteered to wade through waist-deep radioactive water in the basement of the reactor building, searching for valves that needed to be opened. If they couldn't drain that water, if the corium fell into it, the resulting steam explosion could dwarf the original disaster. They put on wetsuits that offered zero radiation protection and disappeared into darkness lit only by headlamps, wading through water contaminated with every radioactive isotope imaginable. They succeeded. They found the valves and drained the water. And contrary to the legend that spreads almost immediately, contrary to the rumors and the newspaper reports, they don't die. Not right away. Ananenko and Bespalov survive, continue working at Chernobyl for years afterward. Baranov passes away later, but from causes that may or may not be related to radiation. The story of their certain death is more dramatic, more fitting with the narrative of noble sacrifice, so that's the version that spreads. But reality is more complicated. That's something you're learning about Chernobyl. Everything is more complicated than it appears. You're 3 months into your deployment when you start noticing changes in your body. You're tired all the time, a bone-deep exhaustion that sleep doesn't fix. Your gums bleed when you brush your teeth. Bruises appear on your arms and legs for no apparent reason. You mention it to the medical staff during your weekly checkup, and they tell you it's normal. It's the stress. It's the poor diet. It's anything except what you both know it really is. Your body is starting to fail. The radiation, accumulated over months of exposure, is destroying your bone marrow. Your body can't produce enough blood cells anymore. The platelets that help your blood clot are running low, hence the bruises and bleeding. Your white blood cells, the ones that fight infection, are depleted. A minor cut that would normally heal in days could become a life-threatening infection. They tell you you've reached your limit. You're being sent home. You should feel relieved. You should be celebrating. but all you feel is numb. Home feels like a foreign concept, like something that happened to someone else in another lifetime. You've been here, in this strange radioactive limbo, for so long that you're not sure you remember how to be a normal person anymore. The bus ride back is quiet, none of the singing from the journey here. The men around you are hollow-eyed and silent. Some are visibly sick, skin problems and hair loss marking them as liquidators even without their uniforms. Others look fine on the surface, but you know they're carrying invisible damage, radiation-induced changes at the cellular level that will manifest as cancer in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. You think about the men still back there. Some of them are just arriving, fresh-faced and optimistic, like you were 3 months ago. They don't know yet what they're walking into. Some of them will be fine, will absorb minimal radiation, and go home with nothing worse than bad memories and a medal. Others will develop acute radiation syndrome, will spend weeks in a hospital watching their bodies disintegrate before dying in agony. Most will fall somewhere in between, carrying a burden of accumulated exposure that will shorten their lives in ways both obvious and subtle. There were 600,000 of them, maybe more. The exact number is uncertain because record-keeping was chaotic, and many military personnel weren't properly documented. They came from across the Soviet Union, from Russia and Ukraine, and Belarus, and the Baltic states, and Azerbaijan, and Georgia. They were soldiers and scientists, miners and engineers, construction workers and farmers, firefighters and pilots, doctors and nurses, janitors and cooks. They were the people who built the sarcophagus, that massive concrete and steel structure designed to entomb Reactor 4 and contain its radiation for the next 100 years. They were the people who decontaminated towns and villages, scraping off topsoil and burying it in special pits, washing buildings and streets with chemicals, destroying thousands of acres of contaminated forest. They shot abandoned pets left behind when Pripyat was evacuated, killing dogs and cats by the thousands to prevent them from spreading radiation. They dug up and reburied entire graveyards that had become contaminated. They did the impossible work of trying to clean up after a nuclear disaster. According to the World Health Organization, the average dose absorbed by liquidators was about 120 millisieverts. That's roughly equivalent to 1,200 chest X-rays absorbed over weeks or months. It's a significant dose, but not immediately life-threatening for most people. 85% of liquidators received doses between 20 and 500 millisieverts. 7% received much higher doses, 200 to 250 millisieverts or more, enough to significantly increase their cancer risks. But these numbers come with massive caveats. The dosimeters often didn't work properly. Many liquidators had no dosimeters at all. The recorded doses only account for gamma radiation, ignoring beta particles that caused extensive skin damage. Military doses are thought to be biased toward artificially high values to justify benefits. Many liquidators were forced to sign documents that deliberately underreported their exposure, making them ineligible for compensation and medical care. The true radiation doses absorbed by liquidators remain, in many cases, unknown and unknowable. What is known is the long-term health impact. According to the Chernobyl Union, the main organization representing liquidators, by 2006, approximately 60,000 Russian and Ukrainian liquidators had died, and 165,000 were disabled. Those numbers, if accurate, represent 10% dead and 28% disabled out of 600,000 total. The World Health Organization disputes these figures, estimating much lower mortality numbers. This disagreement has become one of the many controversies surrounding Chernobyl, with survivor organizations insisting on higher casualty counts and international health bodies arguing for more conservative estimates. Part of the problem is that attributing specific deaths to radiation exposure decades later is scientifically difficult. A liquidator who dies of cancer in 2005, is that death caused by Chernobyl exposure in 1986? Or by some other factor entirely? There's no way to know for certain in individual cases. What is certain is that liquidators show elevated rates of leukemia and thyroid cancer compared to the general population. They show increased incidence of heart disease. They suffer from chronic post-traumatic stress disorder at rates approaching 20%. Many developed severe psychological problems, not just from the trauma of the work itself, but from the uncertainty about their future health, the inadequate government support, and the gradual erosion of the benefits they were initially promised. Because here's what happened to the liquidators after Chernobyl. Initially, the Soviet government praised them as heroes. They received medals and certificates. They were granted special benefits, monthly payments, funded health care, subsidized housing, and public transport. For a few years, being a liquidator meant something, meant you were recognized as someone who had sacrificed for the greater good. Then, the Soviet Union collapsed. The newly independent republics, Russia and Ukraine and Belarus, inherited responsibility for the liquidators, but lacked the resources to support them properly. Benefits were cut. Medical care deteriorated. Monthly payments stopped keeping pace with inflation, eventually becoming almost worthless. Many liquidators found themselves living in poverty, suffering from radiation-induced illnesses with no way to pay for treatment. Worse, the governments began denying that health problems were related to Chernobyl exposure. Liquidators dying of cancer were told their disease was caused by smoking or drinking or genetic factors, anything except the radiation they'd been exposed to in the line of duty. When liquidators developed heart disease or respiratory problems, officials attributed it to poor lifestyle choices rather than radiation exposure. The goal was clear: minimize the official casualty count and the associated financial liability. Some liquidators took their own stories to court, fighting for recognition and compensation. A few won, most lost. The Estonian liquidators, about 4,000 of them, campaigned for years just to receive a modest annual payment, €230 per year, hardly enough to make a meaningful difference. As you drift off to sleep tonight, decades removed from those events in 1986, you might wonder what lessons Chernobyl teaches us. The obvious lesson is about nuclear safety, about the dangers of poorly designed reactors and inadequate training, and a culture that prioritizes production over precaution. That's important, certainly. But there's another lesson in the story of the liquidators. It's about what societies ask of ordinary people during crises, about the gap between the recognition promised and the support actually provided, about the way heroism and sacrifice can be exploited, celebrated in the moment, and then quietly forgotten when it becomes inconvenient or expensive to honor. The liquidators saved Europe from a catastrophe that could have been far worse. If the corium had reached the groundwater, if the cooling pond water had caused another explosion, if the fires had spread to the other reactors, the contamination could have rendered vast areas uninhabitable. Some scientists estimated that such a worst-case scenario could have made much of the continent dangerous for human habitation for thousands of years. That didn't happen because 600,000 people walked into an invisible fire. Most of them were between 20 and 35 years old. Most were men, though some women served in medical and support roles. Many were soldiers following orders, but a significant number volunteered, either initially or by extending their service beyond what was required. They worked with inadequate protection, incomplete information, and barely functional equipment. They improvised armor from lead sheets. They worked in conditions so radioactive that the clothes they wore had to be buried as waste afterward. They developed strange health problems and were told those problems weren't real. The last reactor at Chernobyl shut down in the year 2000. The original sarcophagus, built in 6 months under impossible conditions, began to deteriorate. Between 2016 and 2018, a massive new structure called the New Safe Confinement was built to slide over the old sarcophagus, encasing it completely. This new structure is designed to contain the radioactive material for at least another 100 years. The cleanup continues. It will continue until 2065, maybe longer. The work is less dramatic now, performed with better equipment and safety measures, but it's still happening. The exclusion zone around Chernobyl, that 30-kilometer radius from which people were evacuated, remains largely abandoned. Nature has returned to Pripyat, trees growing through buildings, animals reclaiming the streets. It's beautiful in a haunting way, a monument to what happens when humans push technology too far without adequate safeguards. And somewhere in Russia, in Ukraine, in Belarus, in Estonia and Latvia and Azerbaijan, and a dozen other former Soviet republics, liquidators are growing old. Or they've already died, their names added to memorials, their stories slowly fading from collective memory. Their children and grandchildren carry questions about inherited health effects, about genetic damage passed down through generations, questions that medical science still struggles to answer definitively. The liquidators didn't get a Hollywood ending. They didn't save the day and ride off into the sunset. They walked into an invisible fire, did impossible work in unimaginable conditions, and then went home to watch their health deteriorate while their governments quietly tried to forget they existed.